Across the courtyard from the planetary court, you actually have the home of Cyrus Teed, the oldest standing building on the property. And I want to go into Cyrus Teed's genealogy more, maybe a little bit later in the video. But he was related to one of Joseph Smith's multiple wives. I didn't actually know this, and I visited on a hunch, planning basically to come back here at a later date and do a more in-depth tour. But what I had found is that a friend of mine who is a researcher into the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints told me how to use seer stones. And I found a seer stone while hiking. And the black stone told me to visit the Koreshan State Park. So the Koreshianity community here believed that they would be the nucleus of a 10 million person settlement, that this would be the very center of it. And on the right you have the planetary court where all decisions would be made by a panel of women and perhaps a few men. You have here the founder's house, that is where Cyrus Teed actually lived. And over here you had their connection to the outside world. Now a lot of this still remains very mysterious because they didn't really write everything down. On the right, that yellow building is the general store, which provided a lot of much needed goods to the communities between Venice and Naples. It was pretty much the only thing there. And over here we have a cabin at which a series of brutal murders took place. It's so fascinating that this community probably lived for as long as it did based on their proximity to, I mean, they were a vital link between Venice and Naples. They were pretty much the only thing here, and they said that, like I said earlier, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison actually visited this community for the shows because they were often in the local area. And on the subject of people who visited, this bamboo was from Thomas Edison. He came through here and he gave one of the followers a bamboo plant because he was planting a little bit of it, and now it's growing all along the river, and boats would come from miles around to see shows performed on the steps here. And this is a cabin belonging to Gustav Dom Kohler, and I'll tell you two separate stories. The first one is the story that's told on the information plaque. That story says that Gustav created this cabin in the 1880s, and he had 300 acres of property. Eventually, he read a pamphlet on Koreshianity and invited Cyrus Teed to come and view the property. Eventually, most of his family died, and none of them were able to inherit that property. However, I was told a drastically different story relating to how his family died exactly, and that story is a little bit more morbid. According to the park volunteer Dina, Dom Kohler had something like 72,000 acres of property, and eventually Cyrus Teed came down basically requesting to view it, and they made him feel welcomed. They cooked him meals, they really took care of him, and so Dom Kohler agreed to sell the property for only $200, which in reality was mostly just paying off the debts he had owed on the property. If you wanted to join the sect, you had to hand over all of your possessions and live communally. Well, somebody came up and asked Dom Kohler, as the official on-paper property holder here, if they could basically rent 2 acres of land. And that's exactly what he did. Well, Dom Kohler decided to go up to town, and he would usually be gone for a couple weeks at a time because he was an orange salesman. He had a grove of oranges. And when he came back, he found that his wife and his children had all been poisoned and killed, and one of his sons, who was just barely hanging on, he was almost dead, he explained that the man who rented the property from Dom Kohler had poisoned them all, either with lead or with arsenic, and planned on murdering Dom Kohler as he got back to the cabin. Now, this murder never took place, and Dom Kohler, eventually distraught at the loss of his family, buried his family over here. And I believe one of his children survived and was always very upset at their father. They saw it as him getting really ripped off by Cyrus Teed and selling the property to somebody who was a con man. And basically they had to bury the family right in the backyard, and of course nowadays no records survive. And they say that the plan of the murderer was to kill the entire Dom Kohler family and then move in here with his girlfriend and just pretend to be Dom Kohler. Of course, there was a community of Koreshians here, and that never would have happened. And it makes me wonder, did Dom Kohler kill his family and just claim that this guy was here because he moved to Alaska pretty soon thereafter? I mean, if one of his sons survived, who knows? But we know this because Dom Kohler actually wrote a very short book, only about 40 or so pages, explaining what happened. And his cabin was right across from Cyrus Teed's original home. And I'm not sure, these might actually be the graves of the Dom Kohler family. They're certainly not marked, but this is his cabin. Let's take a look inside. Wonder if you can't see anything. Very bare bones. Florida pioneers. And this is Bamboo Landing, from which a good number of their shows would be held. And this is sort of basically back in the day before roads. I mean, you had roads, they were little carriage roads, but they weren't as well built up as a highway naturally. They would come and view shows performed right there. And I wonder if the information about the Calusic Kingdom had any special meaning to the followers of Cyrus Teed, Prophet Koresh. I mean, you've got Indian mounds right here and all throughout the park, and of course, Joseph Smith found the plates in an Indian mound. They probably saw this as something that was a predecessor culture, a kingdom. The Mormons would call them the Lamanites and the Nephites. And I mean, naturally, Joseph Smith started his religion at a Indian mound, and maybe Cyrus Teed had some ideas about the cultures which came before the modern Americans. In the town square, we have the grave of Hedwig Michel, the last prophet and leader of Koreshianity, and her story is fascinating, worthy of a book. In the 1890s, she was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and by the 1940s, she began to see that the Nazis were something that needed to be fled from. But at the time, she was reading the old works of Cyrus Teed and migrated to Florida, hoping to find a vibrant colony. Instead, finding it, basically it had lost 90% of its members after the death of their prophet in the early 1900s. And she moved in and really helped to revitalize the community. Without her, I'm sure there would be nothing left of these buildings. And she died in 1982. And I think that the quote here is great. "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." And although they were never able to achieve their 10 million people living in a perfect commune with the planetary congress in the center of it, I think that they achieved some good in promoting the arts and helping revitalize this part of southern Florida. After all, without her guidance, none of this would be here. And this is the Koreshian bakery, and I think it's very interesting because they would actually teach young boys to act as bakers. They believed not in just educating boys in sports and athletics, as was very common in the day. They believed in a holistic education, and they also believed in communal raising of children. So the boys would live on the second floor, and they would be taught to bake bread, and the bread, of course, would be put on sale over here behind the founder's house and the general store on the main road from Venice to Naples. And the community, at least in the time of Cyrus Teed, Prophet Koresh, was governed by one man and 7 women that lived inside of this house, which called itself the planetary court. The last person, the last female president of the church, and the last person to join the church, Hedwig Michel, took up residence here in 1941, and she would die here in 1982, and she's buried right over here by the bakery, out front of the bakery. But let's walk inside of the planetary court, and I'll give you a little bit of a tour. But that's Hedwig Michel's grave, by the way. I'll tell you about her in a minute. And this is the old art hall built in the early 1900s, where plays were performed and art was hung, because Cyrus Teed encouraged his followers to embrace the arts. And it was here that I met Dina, who told me a little bit about this religious group's history. I'll tell you more inside, and I'll show you how they proved the earth was hollow, and we live inside. We're here inside the art house, and I'm going to dub over the video if I can't get it right the first time, but I wanted to show you some of the displays. Cyrus Teed would travel around the country using this globe, and basically they took the paper off the outside of a globe and pasted it on the inside, and he claimed that when he had taken his high dose of electricity, an angel revealed that we were living inside of a concave hollow earth, and surrounding that earth was a golden thread that was kind of protruding from the sun. And one of the fascinating methods they used to demonstrate this is over here, and these are all original. In fact, the walls Up until the 60s, the state took over in the 60s, they just flipped the walls because it was kind of rotting on the inside. So these are all original wooden walls, but this is a demonstration that Cyrus Teed would use. Assume that the Earth is round like this. Well, if you travel, then these two sticks will get farther apart from this stick. However, if you're on the beach and you travel far away and the Earth is in fact convex or concave, what happens is the sticks will raise up and get level with the larger stick in the middle. And this is kind of demonstrated over here. They did this demonstration in 1897 on Naples Beach, and they used a more precise measurement than the stick over to the left right here. And actually the original one that they used to demonstrate that the Earth was hollow is up here behind the stage. And this is the actual stage that Cyrus Teed would give speeches from. This is the podium he would stand at. And this is their instrument. And if you look around, you can see some of the paintings that were made by his son. And apparently he had an interesting relationship with his father. He wasn't really raised in the church, but it was a church that really promoted a lot of art. And what I think is really interesting, I've not seen their flag before, but that is the flag of Koreshianity. And the idea was that they would establish a city with 10 million people, and the flag kind of represents the city. And one of the things I wanted to point out with the name Koresh, which is actually on his book over here, is that it is a name that's been in kind of esoteric Christian circles for a little while. Of course, with the whole Branch Davidian thing, he named himself David Koresh based on the idea that Yahweh, YHWY, was a breath in, sort of a Hebrew gasp of life, and Koresh was a breath out. So it means sort of life, death. So Koresh is both Hebrew for Cyrus, being his English given name, and also a sort of death rattle, which I'm sure he understood the context of because he came from a very esoteric family. He was apparently related through a distant cousin to Joseph Smith. And you can imagine him delivering speeches from that podium. And there is his uniform and his painting, which was done by his son, that grew up outside of the community. And what I think is so fascinating, in the book, The Allure of Immortality, it actually talks about how they thought that he would be coming back very soon because he died December 22nd, and of course the 25th is Christmas, so they took it as a sign and they put him inside of a special tub that they had built just for his short stature. And they started seeing after a few days, basically his body was rotting, and sort of black mass started behind his head, behind his ear, and worked his way down to his chest. And they started reporting seeing hieroglyphics appearing on his body over his chest, what we now know are just decomposing and veins. And eventually, when that was something that they couldn't really accept anymore, they had let all the kids see it because they thought that he was coming back. They would say the mold is the new life forming on his body, and eventually when it got to be too much, they buried him at the south end of the island. Well, after that, they placed sand around his grave so that they could see his footprints when he resurrected, and placed a boat next to him. And time passed, quite a bit of time passed, and a hurricane blew through, and his coffin was washed out to sea. But this place was basically an art commune for a very long period of time, and Cyrus Teed preached, he was very receptive to art, to feminism, to suffrage, women's suffrage, and he even formed a political party, I believe the Progressive Liberal Party for a little while, which advocated all these things. And because he believed in the nature of God being both male and female, a lot of people, the movement basically just died out. They believed in celibacy, whereas the LDS Church, from which it was a very, very remote descendant, believed in having as many kids as possible. These guys believed in having as few kids as possible. So naturally, even though it probably produced a few very close adherents, because this was a very positive community to grow up in. They promoted art and singing and open-mindedness and spirituality. They just didn't have the numbers to keep the community going beyond the 1960s. And the last member, the last one to join, and the last one to die, died in the early 1980s.
I know a few months
We're here inside of the planetary court, and this was sort of the spiritual center and the governmental center of this community. And we've got a photo on the wall of a woman named Victoria, who Cyrus considered his equal. He didn't believe in marriage in the traditional sense, but she was right there with him. And she assumed after he died that she would sort of get control of the community and the church, but members hated her and they called her spoiled. So after that, she kind of is just lost to history. They kicked her out of the community. But inside of this house, you had 7 women and 1 man who lived here. And as far as we know, there was never any funny business going on, never any real polygamy, although members did think that Cyrus was very attractive, and a lot of people might have joined because of that. But it's very interesting to see the reflection of what his vision gave him, because in his vision, he was experimenting with electricity, and he gave himself a large shack, and he said that an angel visited him that was a woman and explained to him how the world worked and different tenets of spirituality. And after this was explained to him, she revealed, the angel did, that God was actually both man and woman. And so that's how you got to a community where 7 women would basically determine the affairs of the community. And by the way, these stairs were built by a shipbuilder out of, I believe this is, I've heard it called ironwood. They harvested this basically, not the Koreshians, but just people in Florida to near extinction. It's now incredibly rare to find, and you can't even get a nail in it without drilling a start hole. But a huge house, and this was their planetary court. This is where decisions were made. And there's the big man himself. And this is the room of Berthladine Sterling Boomer. And what I think is so interesting about Cyrus Teed and the Koreshians is how they kind of made forays into the regular world. I mean, Berthladine's son went on to go and build the Waldorf Astoria in New York, which is hosted royalty and presidents and incredibly famous people. And they said that Edison and Ford actually visited the art center, because it was the only center for art between here and Fort Myers. So for dozens of miles, it was the only place you could go, and they also had the general store, so it was very well known to the community, and they became very famous as artists. And the bamboo on the property also was brought by Edison from one plant that he gave to a member, and they grew it, and it really took root very quickly. And this is inside the founder's home, Cyrus Teed. As you look over here, you know, I love visiting graves, and the story here is, of course, that Cyrus Teed's grave washed out into the ocean after that whole fiasco of his followers trying to see something in his body, basically reading into what they believed were ruins or hieroglyphics appearing in his rotting flesh. And eventually they buried him, and his grave was washed out to sea. The only thing we have left of that is right down there, and that is original. And I'll throw a photo in right here to show what it would have looked like back in the day, but you can see it right there on his grave. And what I think is interesting is we don't really know why he had such an obsession with Napoleon, but the park volunteer that was explaining to me said maybe he had something, kind of a soft spot for Napoleon, because Napoleon, like himself, was short and very charismatic. And so in his room, you have a couple of paintings and statues of Napoleon, a fold-down bed. And as you walk around the house, you can see some very interesting pictures. And you see here, these are the Koreshian children. And this is Cyrus Teed and his second, basically what you might call a non-traditional wife. And everybody disliked her. I believe her name was Victoria. Everybody disliked her, and she eventually was kicked out. And you can see the people here, they have an alchemical symbol. It was her birthday. It was his other's birthday. So it's a lunar celebration, they believe, because you have the moon, and then the 6-sided star is sort of not the Star of David, because it wasn't a Jewish sect, but it meant as above, so below. And what I think is so interesting is he took the name Koresh, and the park guide who was explaining this to me said she actually grew up in Texas, and up until a few months ago they would have said that it's just a coincidence that Dave Koresh took the name Dave Koresh instead of Vernon Wayne Howell, but apparently one of the women that went to this commune later went on to go and speak with Powell and basically explained to him the tenets of Cyrus Teed aka Prophet Koresh, and Vernon Wayne Howell began going by David Koresh. And so that's a direct tie. Dave Koresh probably actually read some of the things that Cyrus Teed was writing. Fascinating story. As you look here, you can see there is a bamboo landing, and this was right on the river outside, and for years boats would line up as performances were held, and that landing is right over here. And also, as you look around, you've got a small little shack with a tragic murder story there that belonged to the original property owner, and the only store for miles, which is how this movement really spread its ideology into the surrounding community and became such an eccentric oddity. And I really like the note on this telescope, because this was built around 1850 to 1900, and as the Koreshians were looking through it on the beach, they were hoping to see something on the other side, because again they realized or believed that they were inside of a hollow earth and they were on the inner layer, and so they were looking to see lights probably in the sky at night that they believed were from cities on the opposite side of the planet. And this is the Koreshan cemetery right off of the main road. And that is Abigail Wallace McGreedy, died 1943, 2 years after the last prophet moved in from Germany. Robert Graham, 1885 to 1951, born in Frontier County, Nebraska. Ella A. Abraham, 1861 to 1945, born in Dubuque County, Iowa. Alfred W. Graham, born 1855, died 1931. And Florence Graham, born 1881, died 1950, Storm Lake, Iowa. And this is Bertha Sterling Boomer. I talked a little bit about her son over at the settlement. He was known around the world for the work that he did up in New York.